Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, An Invitation to the Countryside. It was on a grey and listless morning that Hercule Poirot received the letter which was to lead him into one of the most curious cases of his career. He was seated at his usual place in the small but immaculate sitting room of his London flat, sipping chocolate of his own particular making, when the morning post arrived. Hastings, who was not, at that moment, in residence but rather abroad, might have remarked on the detective's expression as he delicately slit open the envelope. For within was no trivial request, no society invitation, but a brief and urgent missive penned in the firm, rather old-fashioned hand of Inspector Harwood of the Surrey Constabulary. My dear Poirot, I find myself in need of your assistance. A sudden death occurred last night at Grayleigh Manor under circumstances strongly suggestive of foul play. The deceased, Lady Eleanor Grayleigh, was poisoned. I beg you to come down at once. Yours in haste, Harwood. Poirot set down the letter with a small, grave nod. He disliked the countryside, it was true, mud, draughts, and the risk of dampness to patent leather boots had never appealed to him, but duty, and perhaps curiosity, compelled him. Poison, he murmured to himself, his moustaches quivering. Always, it has the air of cowardice. A knife, it requires courage. A revolver, that is passion. But poison is the weapon of secrecy, of calculation, of those who prefer to kill and yet remain unseen. By noon, Poirot was seated in a hired motorcar, gliding along lanes that wound between hedgerows and autumn fields. Surrey, though pleasant enough to English eyes, appeared to Poirot monotonous and damp. Yet his little grey cells were already astir, for he never approached a case without allowing his imagination to play upon the psychology of the unseen criminal. At last the car turned into a long drive flanked by sombre yews. Grayleigh Manor rose ahead, a great square house of dark stone, its windows like watchful eyes beneath a slate-grey sky. A thin drizzle pattered against the glass. Poirot, stepping down and smoothing his impeccable cuffs, felt the air heavy with foreboding. Inspector Harwood himself greeted him in the cavernous hall, where a fire sputtered ineffectually in the grate. Harwood was a man of solid build and kindly bluntness, though often too eager to seize upon the obvious solution. "Ah, Poirot, thank heavens you came," said he, wringing the detective's hand. "It's as bad as I wrote. Lady Eleanor is gone, poor soul. The doctor says poison, without a doubt. Cyanide, smell of almonds plain as anything." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "And already you suspect?" Harwood gestured towards the drawing room, lowering his voice. "The house holds a tight circle. No strangers about. Whoever did it is among them. The housekeeper, Mrs. Ludlow, carried the poisoned cordial herself. I'll not say more until you've met them all. Come." Poirot followed, taking in every detail, the polished oak floorboards, the vase of chrysanthemums wilting in their water, the faint scent of beeswax polish mixed with something more metallic, the ghost of tragedy, perhaps, lingering in the air. In the drawing-room a small company awaited. Their faces turned towards the newcomer with varying degrees of apprehension and curiosity. Harwood introduced them in turn. Clara Grayleigh, the daughter, sat pale and tremulous upon a sofa. She was a young woman of delicate beauty, but her eyes were red with weeping, and her hands clutched a crumpled handkerchief. Beside her stood Henry Vale, her fiancé, handsome and assured, with the air of one who meant to protect and yet could not conceal his own unease. At the sideboard hovered Mrs. Ludlow, the housekeeper, a stout woman with anxious eyes, who bobbed a nervous curtsy. In a high-backed chair by the fire sat Mr. Adrian Marsh, the family solicitor, composed and urbane, his dark suit impeccable. Lastly, at the far end of the room, half in shadow, lounged young Edward Grayleigh, nephew to the deceased, his manner restless, fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair. Poirot bowed with courteous formality. "Mesdames et messieurs, permit me to offer my condolences. I am Hercule Poirot. Inspector Harwood has asked that I assist in the sad affair which has taken place here. I beg your patience as I make my inquiries." There was a murmur among them. Clara sobbed softly, Henry pressed her hand. Mrs. Ludlow muttered, "Terrible, terrible," while Edward gave a short, nervous laugh. Only Marsh inclined his head with cool politeness. Poirot allowed his gaze to move slowly across the company. "Lady Eleanor, I am told, was taken ill after supper last night." Marsh replied with measured tones. "Yes. She partook only of her cordial, as was her habit. Not long after, she complained of dizziness, and within minutes she collapsed." "The cordial," murmured Poirot. "Prepared for her alone." Mrs. Ludlow stepped forward, twisting her apron. "Yes, sir. The lady liked it sweetened with honey. I made it up myself and brought it in. No one else touched it. Yet no one else fell ill." "No, sir." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Alas! A most deliberate act. Forgive me, where is the glass now?" Harwood fetched it from the sideboard, still bearing the faint sticky residue. Poirot raised it delicately, sniffed, and his nostrils flared. Bitter almonds. Clear as the stars on a frosty night. Cyanide, indeed. A murmur swept the room. Clara hid her face against Henry's shoulder. Edward shifted uneasily, his eyes darting. Poirot set the glass down gently. "Miss Amiss, I will tell you this, the one who placed the poison is among you. It was not chance, nor mistake. Lady Eleanor was chosen to die." Mrs. Ludlow gave a gasp. Clara cried, "But who would wish her harm?" Poirot regarded her keenly. "That, mademoiselle, is what we shall discover. Each of you, I think, had reason, though not all reasons are equal. To love, to fear, to gain, or to lose, motive hides in many places. But motive alone does not make the murderer. For that, we need the little grey cells." He touched his forehead gently, as though in benediction. The silence which followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Poirot turned towards Harwood. "We must proceed, mon cher. Already I see the threads of a web. But first, I require that no one leaves this house. The murderer is among us, and we shall not permit him, or her, to escape." At this declaration, the company stirred uneasily. Clara clutched Henry's hand tighter. Edward gave another of his nervous laughs, which died quickly under Poirot's piercing gaze. Mrs. Ludlow wrung her hands. Only Marsh remained impassive, his eyes fixed calmly upon the little Belgian detective. Poirot bowed slightly, his expression serene. "Now, if you please, I will examine the scene of the tragedy itself. Let us go to Lady Eleanor's chamber." And thus began the investigation at Grayleigh Manor, a house wrapped in silence, where grief and fear sat hand in hand, and where, though hidden for the moment, the shadow of the murderer was already present, waiting. Chapter 2: Shadows at Supper. The great dining hall of Grayleigh Manor, though elegant, retained an oppressive solemnity in the aftermath of tragedy. A long mahogany table gleamed under the muted glow of shaded lamps, and on the sideboard stood the remnants of the final supper Lady Eleanor had shared with her household, dishes cleared, silver polished, but one damning object left behind, the cordial glass that had carried her death. Poirot stood near the hearth, his small form perfectly composed, his gaze flitting from one occupant of the room to another. Inspector Harwood, at his side, cleared his throat with a certain bluster. "Well then, Poirot, here we are. Everyone present last evening, just as they were when Lady Eleanor drank her cordial. Perhaps you'll do the honors. Poirot inclined his head gravely. It is always better, mon cher, to let the people speak for themselves. It is not the words alone that matter, but the manner, the hesitation, the glance of the eyes. Voila, psychology is the key. He turned towards Clara Grayleigh. The young woman looked frail, her pale cheeks marked by tears, her slender frame drooping like a flower deprived of sun. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you were present when your mother partook of her cordial. Yes, Clara whispered, twisting her handkerchief. She drank it just after we had finished eating. She seemed quite cheerful, even amused. And then, Clara broke off, choking on a sob. Henry Vale, seated beside her, placed a protective arm around her shoulders. She needn't distress herself with details, monsieur. You have the facts already. Pardon, monsieur, Poirot said softly, but the facts, they are like the bones of a body. Without the flesh, they mean nothing. We must dress them with the color of life if we are to see the truth. Clara lifted her eyes, watery but determined. She laughed at something Edward said. It was about one of the dogs, I think. She drank her cordial, and only moments later she looked faint. Then she cried out. It was so sudden. We thought she would recover, but then... Edward Grayleigh, lounging with affected nonchalance in his chair, interjected with a forced chuckle. I suppose it wasn't my joke that killed her, eh? No one laughed. Henry shot him a look of disgust. Mrs. Ludlow gasped and crossed herself. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Humour, Monsieur Edward, can sometimes be a mask for fear. Tell me, you sat opposite Lady Eleanor. Edward's grin faltered. Yes. Yes, I did. But I didn't go near her glass, if that's what you're driving at. Poirot merely smiled, as if the remark had been unnecessary, and turned his attention to Mrs. Ludlow. You prepared the cordial, madam? Yes, sir, the housekeeper replied, wringing her hands in her apron. I warmed the honey, mixed it with water and a little lemon, just as her ladyship liked. I carried it in myself, placed it before her on the silver tray. No one else touched it, I swear it. Poirot studied her closely. She was a woman of plain honesty, her eyes wide with fright but unclouded by guile. Did you see anyone approach the tray before Lady Eleanor drank? He asked. No, sir. I left it there and went back to the kitchen. When I returned, she had already fallen. Poirot nodded, filing the answer neatly in his mind. At last, he turned to Adrian Marsh. The solicitor, upright and composed, gave a small bow of acknowledgement. You were seated where, monsieur? 3 places down, on Lady Eleanor's right, Marsh replied smoothly. I had no occasion to touch her glass. I recall only that she raised it with her usual grace, sipped, and then, alas, the poison took hold. Poirot leaned forward ever so slightly. And you, monsieur, did you notice aught unusual in her manner, or in the manner of those around her? Marsh considered. There was nothing untoward, save perhaps Edward's jest. Lady Eleanor seemed entirely herself. Poirot allowed a pause to stretch, as if weighing the still air. So. Each of you saw, each of you heard, and yet no one saw the hand of the murderer move. Curious, is it not? It is as though the poison floated down from heaven into the glass. Edward gave another nervous laugh. Maybe it did. The old place has always had a cursed air. Poirot's moustaches twitched. No, monsieur. It is not the spirits of the dead who place cyanide in a cordial. It is the very human hand of the living. The silence that followed was taut, the crackle of the fire loud against the hush. Poirot stepped to the sideboard, where the glass remained. He lifted it delicately, holding it to the light. The faint residue glistened sticky and golden. Note well, he said. The cordial was prepared in the kitchens, but the poison was not added there. Had it been so, Lady Eleanor would have tasted the bitterness at once and remarked upon it. No, Miss Amos, the poison was added here, in this very room, after the cordial was placed upon the tray. Mrs. Ludlow uttered a faint cry. Clara pressed her hand to her lips. Henry frowned, and Marsh's brow furrowed slightly. Edward gave a shrug. If you say so, monsieur. But who could have done it? We were all in plain sight of one another. Poirot set the glass down with precision. Exactly so. And yet it was done. The hand that poisoned was quick, cunning, and concealed by the very closeness of your gathering. He surveyed them with grave eyes, one by one. The murderer was here at supper. The murderer watched Lady Eleanor raise the glass. And the murderer knew the cordial was hers alone. The words seemed to hang in the air like a pall. Clara let out a stifled sob, Henry murmured comfort, and Mrs. Ludlow shook her head muttering, "Oh, Lord save us." Poirot allowed them a moment, then said quietly, "The truth, it will come. Already there are small details, trifles, that speak to me. But we must be orderly. Each of you will tell me of your movements, before supper, during, and after. The smallest fact may prove of the greatest importance." Harwood gave a grunt of approval. He's right. Best to start at the beginning. Poirot raised a hand. Not tonight, Inspector. These people are weary, distraught. Tomorrow we will begin afresh. For now, let them rest, though I think rest will not come easily in this house. He bowed slightly to the company. Bourne knew it, mesdames et messieurs. May your dreams be peaceful, though the truth is not. And with that, Poirot turned and left the dining hall, leaving behind a silence weighted with suspicion. Each occupant glanced at the other, furtively, uneasily, for they knew the detective was right. The murderer had been present at that supper, smiling, speaking, raising a glass like the rest. And still seated among them, unseen, the murderer listened in silence, waiting for the next move. Chapter 3, The Closed Circle. The morning dawned with a faint mist clinging to the lawns of Grayleigh Manor. A pale sun struggled through, doing little to dispel the heavy mood that lay upon the house. The servants moved about with hushed steps, as though fearful of waking some sleeping terror. Poirot, immaculate as ever in a grey suit with a perfectly matched tie pin, descended to the breakfast room at precisely 8 o'clock. He found Inspector Harwood already there, standing rather awkwardly by the sideboard where bacon and eggs cooled in silver dishes. "Morning, Poirot," Harwood said, rubbing his hands. "I've been thinking. The case is as plain as a pikestaff. The housekeeper prepared the cordial, carried it in, and placed it before Lady Eleanor. No one else had the chance." Poirot shook his head slowly, buttering his toast with neat strokes. "Mon cher, you leap as always to the obvious conclusion. But the obvious, it deceives. Mrs. Ludlow is an honest woman. She has served the family for many years, non? Would she risk her comfort, her position, and her pension for what? No gain. No motive." Harwood frowned. Motive or no, she had opportunity. Poirot sipped his chocolate with contentment. It is never enough. To solve a crime, one must have both motive and opportunity. It is like the two blades of scissors. Without both, the cut cannot be made. Harwood muttered but said no more. At 9:30, Poirot summoned the household to the library. They came reluctantly, faces pale in the thin morning light. Clara entered first, still fragile but composed, Henry close at her side. Mrs. Ludlow followed, clutching her apron, and then Edward, dishevelled, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. Adrian Marsh was the last, gliding in with measured calm. Poirot stood before them, hands clasped neatly behind his back. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, it is clear to me that the murderer is here, within this very house. The crime was no accident, no intrusion from outside. Lady Eleanor was poisoned by one of those she trusted. A murmur passed through the company. Clara uttered a faint cry. Henry's hand closed tightly over hers. Poirot lifted a finger. And so, we have what is called the closed circle. We need not search the highways and byways. The truth lies here, beneath this very roof. Let us examine together the question of motive. He moved to the center of the room, his gaze settling on Clara. Mademoiselle, forgive me. It is painful, but it must be said. You stand to inherit a great fortune upon your mother's death, do you not? Clara's eyes widened with horror. Monsieur Poirot. How can you suggest? I loved her. I would never. Henry sprang to his feet. This is outrageous. Clara adored her mother. To insinuate such a thing is cruel. Poirot inclined his head. Calmez vous, monsieur. I suggest nothing, I only observe. Where there is money, there is always suspicion. But motive, I remind you, is not proof. He turned his gaze upon Henry. And you, monsieur? You are soon to marry Clara. A marriage that brings with it wealth, position, comfort. Do you see, Inspector? Again, there is motive. And yet, do I accuse? None. I observe. Henry flushed, but said nothing. Poirot now addressed Edward, who sprawled in his chair with careless bravado. And you, Monsieur Edward? It is whispered, you have debts. Edward stiffened. What of it? Many young men have debts. Ah, my's OUI. But yours, I think, are considerable. Gambling, perhaps? Your aunt was not indulgent. Might her death have been convenient? Edward laughed harshly. If you're trying to say I killed her for money, you'll have to prove it. And you can't. Poirot spread his hands. Again, I accuse no one. I only place the possibilities upon the table. His gaze rested finally upon Adrian Marsh. And you, Monsieur le Notaire. You were her ladyship's trusted adviser. You control the estate, the investments, the accounts. Such trust is a heavy burden. Were there, perhaps, difficulties of which she was unaware? Marsh's expression did not alter. Lady Eleanor was fully informed of all matters, I assure you. Her affairs are in order. Poirot's moustaches twitched. Indeed? Yet yesterday, I discovered a draft letter upon her desk. A letter never sent. It spoke of an alarming discovery she intended to reveal to her solicitor. You, monsieur. But curiously, the name of the person concerned was left unwritten. For the first time, Marsh hesitated. It was only a flicker, a brief tightening of the lips, but Poirot saw it. You have quite an imagination, Monsieur Poirot, Marsh said smoothly. Perhaps Lady Eleanor intended only to remind me of some trifling matter. Poirot bowed slightly. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Each face betrayed its own turmoil, fear, indignation, unease. At last Poirot spoke again, his tone calm. You see, Miss Amos, how simple it is. Each of you, in your own way, had reason to wish Lady Eleanor gone. And yet only one hand placed the poison in her glass. Who? That is the question. Mrs. Ludlow wrung her hands. But how could anyone have done it, sir? We were all sitting right there at the table. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactment. That is the fascination of the case. The poison was added swiftly, silently, while eyes were elsewhere. perhaps during a moment of laughter or when a dish was passed. The murderer relied upon distraction, upon the blindness of those who see but do not observe. He tapped his temple. But Hercule Poirot, he observes. Edward gave a short, mocking laugh. Well, monsieur, if you're so observant, why not just name the culprit now and be done with it? Poirot's smile was serene. Patience, my young friend. A crime is like a puzzle. One must place each piece correctly. To rush is to err. Already, I have seen enough to know this: the crime was not committed by chance, nor by impulse. It was planned with care. The poison was chosen for its swiftness, its certainty. This was murder cold and deliberate. Clara shuddered, and Henry placed an arm about her shoulders once more. Poirot moved towards the window, gazing out at the mist-shrouded lawns. His voice, when he spoke again, was quiet but firm. Until the truth is known, none of you must leave Grayleigh Manor. The murderer is here, in this house. And I will find him. The declaration fell upon the room like a sentence. For a moment, no one stirred. Then Clara began to weep softly, Mrs. Ludlow crossed herself once more, Edward scowled into the fire, and Marsh, ever calm, folded his hands upon his lap. Poirot turned back to them, his small figure neat and composed. Now, Miss Amos, I ask only this: be patient. The little grey cells, they work in silence, but they work surely. And in the end, justice will speak. He bowed and left them to their unease, leaving behind a company bound together by grief, fear, and suspicion, a circle closed upon itself, from which there could be no escape. Chapter 4 of A Whisper in the Night. The night settled over Grayleigh Manor with an oppressive stillness. The corridors, long and shadowed, held the faint odour of old wood and extinguished fires. Outside, the mist crept close against the windows, and the wind sighed faintly through the chimneys like some restless spirit. Poirot, though not a man inclined to nervous fancies, was keenly aware of the house's heavy silence as he prepared for bed. He had retired early, for his little grey cells, he maintained, functioned best after orderly rest. His chamber, though modest, was kept as neat as a military camp, shoes polished and aligned, brushes laid side by side, handkerchiefs folded with geometrical precision. Yet at the stroke of midnight he found his repose disturbed. A sound, soft, deliberate, stirred in the corridor beyond his door. Footsteps. Light, careful footsteps, moving with caution as though the walker feared to be overheard. Poirot sat up at once, his senses alert. He listened, holding his breath. Yes, there it was again, a faint scuff, then another. Slowly, quietly, he rose, slipping his feet into slippers, adjusting his dressing gown, and opening the door a crack. The corridor lay in half-darkness, the lamps dimmed. Down its length he glimpsed a flicker of movement, a shadow passing the junction that led towards the library. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Tiens," he murmured. "It is not the hour for reading. Unless, perhaps, one reads by stealth." He stepped into the corridor, his patent leather slippers making no sound, and followed with the quiet tread of a cat. The library door stood ajar. Through the gap spilled the faint glow of candlelight. Poirot approached, then paused, tilting his head. A rustle of papers, the scrape of a drawer, someone searched with urgent hands. He pushed the door open gently. Inside, by the light of a single candle, Edward Grayleigh stood bent over a desk. His hair was tousled, his face pale, his hands trembling as he rifled through a sheaf of papers. He started violently at Poirot's quiet voice. "Bonsoir, Monsieur Edward." A strange hour for correspondence, n'est-ce pas? Edward whirled around, his eyes wide, the papers clutched to his chest. You startled me." What are you doing creeping about at this time of night?" Poirot entered calmly, closing the door behind him. "Moi? I follow the footsteps. You pass my chamber, and my ears are quick. And you, monsieur, what do you seek among these papers, so late? Edward flushed. It's none of your business. These are family matters. Poirot moved closer, his head slightly inclined, his gaze piercing. My's OUI. But family matters may also be murder matters, hein? Permit me. With a deft gesture, Poirot indicated the papers. Edward hesitated, then reluctantly allowed him to glance. They were letters, neatly arranged, bearing Lady Eleanor's hand. One lay open, half crumpled, its ink faded but legible. Poirot read a few lines. It was a letter of promise. Lady Eleanor had written of her intention to settle certain of Edward's debts, provided he undertook to reform his ways. Poirot looked up sharply. So, you searched for proof, perhaps? To save yourself? Or perhaps to conceal? Edward's jaw tightened. I wasn't hiding anything. I needed to find it. To show Marsh. His executor. I thought maybe she left instructions. I can't, his voice faltered, and he turned away. You don't know what it's like to owe every man in town. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Ah. Desperation, it is a strong motive. Yet, monsieur, one thing puzzles me. Your movements tonight, so furtive, so clumsy. You knew you might be seen. And yet the desk, when you leave it, is always so neat, as though you wish me to notice. Pourquoi? Edward spun around, startled. What do you mean? Poirot smiled faintly. I mean that you act a part. You play the guilty man too well. The untidy hands, the nervous laugh, it is overdone. A clever actor is always betrayed by his eagerness. Voila. Edward stared, mouth open, then gave a harsh laugh. You think I'm pretending? That I want you to suspect me? That's mad. Poirot shook his head gently. Not mad, monsieur. Desperate. To conceal the truth, sometimes a man thrusts suspicion upon himself. It is a shield, a masquerade. Edward's hand trembled as he set down the candle. Shadows leapt across his pale face. You think I killed her? Poirot's voice was calm. I think, perhaps, you wish me to think so. But if that is the case, then the truth lies elsewhere. The silence in the great library deepened. The candle flame wavered in the draught, throwing long fingers of shadow across the shelves. The smell of old leather, ink, and dust mingled with something more human, fear. At last Edward muttered, "Believe what you like. But I didn't kill her. I swear it. If I wanted her money, why would I make myself look guilty?" Poirot inclined his head gravely. An excellent question. I shall consider it. But remember, monsieur, innocence does not always excuse imprudence. Play acting with suspicion may entangle you in a net you did not weave. Edward sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Poirot replaced the letters neatly in the desk, every sheet precisely aligned, and extinguished the candle. As they stepped back into the corridor, Poirot's mind was active. He had seen guilt, yes, but it was guilt of a curious kind. The boy's actions were almost too convenient, too conspicuous, as if he wished the world to declare him villainous while hiding another truth. Poirot returned to his chamber, closing the door softly. He lay awake for some time, his little grey cells arranging the puzzle. Edward sought to be suspected, but why? To shield another? To distract from the true murderer? He murmured to himself in the darkness, "C'est curieux. He is guilty of something, but perhaps not of murder. The murderer, I think, is cleverer still. He hides behind Edward's shadow. A shadow cast, perhaps, by design." And with that thought, Poirot finally drifted into slumber, the whisper of footsteps still echoing faintly in his ears. Chapter 5: The Gathering Storm. The following day dawned with heavy skies. A raw wind rattled the windows of Grayleigh Manor, and the drizzle, steady and relentless, blurred the lawns into a misty grey expanse. Inside, the air felt close, the atmosphere strained. It was as though the house itself held its breath, waiting for something dreadful yet to come. Poirot breakfasted alone, as was his preference, then made his way to the morning room. He paused in the corridor, noting the subdued movements of the servants, the uneasy silence broken only by the occasional creak of a stair or distant shutting of a door. Grayleigh, once a house of stately calm, had become a place of whispers and watchful glances. At 10 o'clock, he gathered the household again in the library. They came reluctantly, like players forced upon the stage of a tragedy they wished no part of. Clara appeared first, pale and wan, her eyes shadowed from sleeplessness. She clung to Henry Vale's arm, who entered beside her with brisk, protective energy. Edward arrived soon after, his expression strained, his coat thrown carelessly over his shoulders as though he had risen too late. Mrs. Ludlow bustled in, muttering under her breath about wickedness in the house. Last came Adrian Marsh, calm, immaculate, his every gesture measured. Poirot regarded them serenely, hands folded before him. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "you have passed another night under this roof with fear for company. But take courage. Already the pattern of this crime becomes clearer. Soon, perhaps, the mask will fall." Henry gave an impatient snort. "With respect, Monsieur Poirot, we are all on edge." Clara is half beside herself. "Can't you act more quickly? You say you see patterns, but still no arrest." Poirot inclined his head gently. "Patience, monsieur. Murder is a weed that grows deep. One does not pluck it up by the leaves. One digs carefully, until one reaches the root." Edward let out a nervous laugh. "Well, dig faster, man, or the root will strangle us all." Poirot's eyes rested upon him with faint curiosity. "You fear that the murderer will strike again, perhaps?" Edward shrugged but did not meet his gaze. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch. He observed each face, the tension around Clara's mouth, the protective arm of Henry, the nervous tapping of Edward's foot, Mrs. Ludlow's downcast eyes, and Marsh's still, inscrutable composure. Each played their role, each concealed their truth. At length Poirot dismissed them, with a polite bow. "Merci. You may go about your day. I will trouble you again later." One by one, they filed out, leaving Poirot alone in the great library. The rain pattered against the tall windows. The fire burned low. Poirot moved with deliberate steps to Lady Eleanor's writing desk, an elegant piece of mahogany set near the far wall. The surface was immaculate, as though tidied by loving or guilty hands. Poirot seated himself, opened the drawers, and examined the contents. Letters neatly bundled, accounts in careful order, yet something caught his eye. A sheet of paper, folded once, lay apart from the others. It bore Lady Eleanor's handwriting, but the lines were unfinished. Poirot smoothed it delicately, reading by the grey light of the rain-streaked window. "My dear Mr. Marsh, I write in haste, for I have made a discovery which alarms me. Concerning one close to me, I can say no more at present save that I must speak with you directly. There are matters which may endanger not only my peace but my safety. I beg you to come at once." The letter broke off there, the pen's line trailing into nothing, as if interrupted. Poirot sat very still, his moustaches twitching. "Très intéressant," he murmured. "She wrote of a discovery. Someone close to her. Not an enemy from without, but from within. And to whom does she address this warning?" "To Monsieur Marsh." He replaced the letter carefully, then leaned back, fingertips pressed together. A picture began to form. Lady Eleanor had found something dangerous. She had intended to tell her solicitor. She had not lived to do so. Poirot rose, pacing the room. His thoughts ran in ordered sequence. Clara, the grieving daughter, too fragile, perhaps, for calculated murder. Henry, impatient, protective, yet wealth through marriage was a motive. Edward, desperate, entangled in debts, a reckless youth who might poison for gain or for show. Mrs. Ludlow, loyal, fearful, without benefit from the death. And Marsh, smooth, impenetrable, a man accustomed to control, upon whom Lady Eleanor had depended. Poirot stopped at the fire, staring into the flames. It is there, the answer. But which thread pulls the whole tapestry apart? His reverie was broken by a knock at the door. Mrs. Ludlow entered, carrying a tray. "I thought you might like some tea, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Poirot accepted with a gracious bow. "Merci, madam." "Tell me, you were fond of Lady Eleanor, were you not?" Mrs. Ludlow's eyes filled with tears. "Fond? She was the best mistress anyone could have. Fair, generous, always kind. Why anyone would harm her, I can't fathom. There's evil in this house now, sir. Evil I never thought to see." Poirot regarded her gently. "Evil often wears a pleasant face, madam. Remember that." She shivered and departed. Poirot sipped the tea thoughtfully, though his mind remained fixed on the unsent letter. By afternoon, the atmosphere of the manor had grown more stifling still. Clara refused luncheon, retiring to her room. Henry prowled the corridors with restless energy. Edward smoked endlessly in the drawing-room, his laughter brittle and forced. Mrs. Ludlow muttered prayers as she polished already shining surfaces. Marsh, ever composed, sat with papers upon his knee, but Poirot noticed the solicitor's eyes straying often towards the windows, as if calculating something beyond their view. The storm outside echoed the storm within. And Poirot, calm and precise, moved quietly among them, gathering trifles. A word here, a glance there, each observation stored like a pearl in his ordered mind. By evening, the house seemed charged with dread. Even Inspector Harwood, normally bluff and confident, confessed to Poirot in low tones, "It's a queer business. The longer we stay, the more it feels like we're trapped inside with a wolf. And the devil of it is, we can't tell which one wears the wolf's skin." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Just so, mon ami. But remember, when one sheep is too placid, too calm amidst fear, one must ask, is it truly sheep, or wolf in disguise?" He left Harwood puzzled, and retired once more to his room. As he prepared for the night, he reflected on the letter in Lady Eleanor's hand. She had discovered something. She had feared for her safety. And before she could reveal it, she had died. "ABN," Poirot murmured, adjusting his moustaches before the glass. "The storm gathers. But soon, the lightning will strike, and we shall see clearly. Until then, patience. Always, patience." And as the rain lashed harder against the windows and the wind howled in the chimneys, Grayleigh Manor seemed less a home and more a prison, holding within its walls a secret dark enough to kill. Chapter 6: The Second Cup. The storm raged on through the night and into the following day. By morning, the manor was wrapped in a curtain of rain, the gardens invisible beyond the streaming windows, the world narrowed to stone walls and restless hearts. The sense of confinement pressed heavily upon the household. No one spoke above a murmur, no one moved without glancing over their shoulder. Poirot, ever fastidious, emerged from his room immaculately dressed, his shoes gleaming though the floorboards groaned with damp. He descended to the breakfast room and found Clara already seated at the table. She looked pale, her hands nervously folding her napkin into smaller and smaller squares. Henry Vale stood at the sideboard, pouring coffee with exaggerated cheer. "You must eat something, Clara," he urged. "You're fading before my eyes." "I cannot," Clara whispered. "Each bite sticks in my throat." Poirot seated himself. "Courage, mademoiselle. Fear is the poison that weakens before any other." At that moment Mrs. Ludlow entered, bearing a tray with a fresh pot of tea and a plate of scones. She set them down with trembling hands. "I thought perhaps Miss Clara might manage some tea," she said softly. Clara gave a faint smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Ludlow. I will try." Poirot's sharp eyes followed every movement. The teapot, porcelain white with delicate green trim, steamed invitingly. Mrs. Ludlow poured a cup and placed it before Clara, adding sugar and a splash of milk with the air of long habit. Clara lifted the cup with fragile fingers. Poirot leaned slightly forward, his moustaches twitching. Something, so small most would have missed it, had caught his attention. A faint grit at the rim of the cup, a speck like undissolved powder, swirling in the tea. His little grey cells leapt at once to alarm. "UN moment, mademoiselle!" His voice cut sharply through the air. He reached across and with a swift, almost theatrical gesture, plucked the cup from Clara's hand. The tea sloshed, a dark stain spreading across the linen cloth. Clara gasped. Henry straightened violently. Mrs. Ludlow gave a small cry. Poirot rose, the cup steady in his hand, and fixed each of them with a piercing gaze. "This tea, it must not be drunk. It is tainted." A stunned silence fell. Then Henry burst out, "What in God's name are you saying?" Poirot's eyes never wavered. "I say, monsieur, that someone has made a second attempt at murder, and that attempt was aimed at Mademoiselle Clara." Clara's face went white. She clutched Henry's arm, trembling. Mrs. Ludlow stammered, "No, no, it cannot be. I brewed it fresh myself." Poirot held up the cup for all to see. The faint residue clung stubbornly at the base. "Observe. This is no mere leaf or dust. It is powder, added after the tea was poured. Look closely." Edward had entered at that moment, yawning, his hair untidy. He stopped short, staring at the tableau. "What's all this? A melodrama at breakfast?" Henry rounded on him. "Clara's tea was poisoned." "God help us, Edward, this is your doing, isn't it?" Edward recoiled, his face flushing. "Mine? Don't be absurd. I've only just come in." The air in the room thickened with accusation. Clara hid her face against Henry's shoulder, sobbing softly. Poirot set down the cup with delicate care, as though handling a sacred relic. His voice, calm and precise, cut through the rising chaos. "Messieurs, mesdames, let us keep our heads. Shouting will not unmask the culprit. We must instead employ reason." He turned to Mrs. Ludlow. "You prepared the tea, madam?" "Yes," she whispered, twisting her apron. "I fetched the pot myself from the kitchen. I poured Miss Clara's cup just now, with my own hands. ABN. Did you leave the pot unattended, even for a moment?" Mrs. Ludlow hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Only when I came into the room. I set the tray down on the table, then fetched the sugar bowl from the sideboard." Perhaps then." Poirot raised a hand. "Just so. A moment is all that was required." Henry's face was red with anger. "Then who? Who touched it?" "None of us here would." Poirot interrupted softly, "Would they not, monsieur? Consider. Each of you had cause to wish Lady Eleanor gone. And now her daughter, her heiress, stands in peril. The hand that struck once, strikes again." His eyes travelled slowly around the room, resting in turn on each face. Edward, pale and defensive. Henry, flushed and furious. Clara, trembling with fear. Mrs. Ludlow, wringing her hands. Each avoided his gaze, save Adrian Marsh, who had appeared silently in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Poirot inclined his head towards Marsh. "Monsieur, you arrive at an opportune moment." Marsh raised an eyebrow. "So it seems. Another attempt, you say?" "Indeed. And now, monsieur, I must insist upon measures. Until this case is solved, no food or drink shall be taken without scrutiny. Every dish, every cup, shall pass under my eye." Clara gave a low moan. "But why me? Why now?" Poirot turned to her gently. "Because, mademoiselle, you are the next obstacle. Lady Eleanor's fortune descends to you. While you live, others cannot benefit. But if you were to die," he let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, yet heavy with meaning. The silence that followed was dreadful. The rain lashed against the panes like a drumbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed in the draught. At last, Poirot placed the cup upon the mantelpiece, separate from all else. "This," he said quietly, "will be examined. It is a key, and it will unlock the door to the murderer. But mark me well, whoever poisoned this tea was in this room. And I, Hercule Poirot, have observed more than they suppose." He gave a little bow, his eyes glinting. "Bon. Now the net tightens. We shall see who thrashes when caught." The household dispersed in uneasy silence, each face clouded with suspicion and dread. Clara was led away by Henry, who swore under his breath vengeance upon the would-be killer. Edward slouched after them, muttering about scapegoats. Mrs. Ludlow fled to the kitchen, weeping. Marsh lingered, cool as ever, offering Poirot a thin smile before withdrawing. Poirot remained alone. He stood before the mantelpiece, gazing thoughtfully at the poisoned cup. His hands rested lightly upon the lapels of his immaculate coat. "Ah," he murmured. "The second blow, it tells me much. The hand that kills is bold, reckless now. But in that recklessness lies the mistake. It is coming. Soon, very soon, the mask will fall." And as the storm howled louder against the windows, the little Belgian detective allowed himself the faintest of smiles, for he knew the endgame had begun. Chapter 7: Shadows at the Table. The storm still clung to Grayleigh Manor on the following day, though the rain had thinned into a fine drizzle. The grounds lay sodden and grey, the air damp with a heaviness that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. The household moved like players in a grim drama, each step measured, each glance weighted with suspicion. Poirot had asked that they all assemble in the dining room for luncheon. It was a calculated request, for he wished to observe them not scattered, but together, forced into one another's company, their unease magnified. The long table was set, its silver polished, its cloth pristine. Yet the splendor seemed hollow. Clara sat at one end, pale as ivory, her eyes shadowed. Henry Vale hovered close beside her, his protective presence almost suffocating. Edward slouched halfway down the table, flicking crumbs from the cloth with nervous fingers, his eyes darting towards every sudden sound. Mrs. Ludlow placed dishes with shaking hands, her face pinched. Adrian Marsh sat with impeccable posture at the far end, surveying the company with calm detachment, as though he presided over a business meeting rather than a household riven by fear. Poirot took his place in the centre, his moustaches perfectly arranged, his gaze sweeping the table. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said with grave courtesy, "today we dine together. Not merely for the sustenance of the body, but for that of the mind. Each of you sits beneath the same roof, each of you suspects the other. Very well, let us speak openly. His words fell like stones in water, sending ripples through the company. Henry burst out first. "It's Edward. We all know it. His debts, his temper, God knows Lady Eleanor threatened to cut him off. And now Clara's nearly killed? He'd inherit if she were gone." Edward leapt up, his chair scraping. "That's a filthy lie. You think I'd poison my own sister? I may have made mistakes, yes, debts, wages, but I'm no murderer." Clara flinched. "Please, please, stop." Poirot lifted a hand. "Sit, sit. Monsieur Edward, the truth is not established by noise. Monsieur Vale, passion is no substitute for proof." Marsh spoke smoothly, his voice carrying across the table. "And yet the boy's position is undeniably precarious. Financial ruin is a strong motive. In my profession, I've seen lesser reasons drive men to desperate acts." Edward glared. "Easy for you to talk. You sit there like some judge, but who gains more than you if Clara dies, eh? You'd control the whole estate as executor. Maybe you don't want anyone to inherit at all." Mrs. Ludlow gasped, nearly dropping a dish. Marsh's eyes narrowed fractionally, but his smile remained. "My dear boy, that is a fanciful theory. Executors administer, they do not enrich themselves." Henry struck the table with his fist. "What about you, Marsh? Eleanor trusted you. Too much, if you ask me. You were forever advising her, forever in her ear. Perhaps she found out something you'd rather keep hidden." A silence followed, sharp and heavy. Clara whispered, "Stop it, stop accusing each other. It's tearing us apart." Poirot watched with hooded eyes, his fingers steepled. He noted each reaction, Edward's reckless anger, Henry's righteous fury, Marsh's smooth defense, Clara's frailty, Mrs. Ludlow's terror. He let the storm rage, for it revealed more than quiet could. At last, Mrs. Ludlow could bear no more. She set down the soup tureen with a clatter. "I'll tell you what I think. There's wickedness in this house, and it's not young Edward, nor Miss Clara. It's someone clever, someone who hides their hand. Mark me, Mr. Poirot, whoever did it walks among us calm as you like, while the rest of us tear at each other's throats." Poirot inclined his head. "Très bien, madame. You speak wisely. The guilty are often calm. Too calm." His gaze drifted deliberately to Marsh, who met it without flinching. Poirot then rose, adjusting his cuffs. "I will tell you something. Already I hold in my hand the thread that leads to the truth. The letter Lady Eleanor began but never finished, the poisoned cup of tea, these are not isolated facts. They form a pattern. And from that pattern, I see the mind of the murderer." The effect was immediate. Every face turned towards him. Edward's mouth opened in disbelief. Clara clutched at Henry's arm. Mrs. Ludlow whispered a prayer. Marsh raised one brow ever so slightly. But, Poirot continued, the time for revelation is not yet. One more piece, and the puzzle will be complete. Henry leaned forward, his voice harsh. "You mean you know who did it, but you won't say?" "Exactment," Poirot replied softly. "To accuse before the net is fully drawn is to risk escape. And I do not permit murderers to escape." Edward groaned. "This is torture. You're playing with us." Poirot shook his head. "No, monsieur. I am playing with the murderer. And soon, the game will end." The luncheon continued, though scarcely anyone ate. Every clink of cutlery sounded too loud, every glance too sharp. Suspicion thickened the air like smoke. When the meal ended, Poirot lingered at the table. He spoke quietly, but with authority. "Until further notice, none of you shall leave the house. The storm may trap us within, but it also serves me well. A cage, Miss Amos, is most useful when one hunts a bird. Mrs. Ludlow crossed herself. Clara rose unsteadily, Henry guiding her away. Edward muttered curses under his breath as he slouched out. Marsh alone paused at the door, meeting Poirot's gaze with a cool half-smile. You seem very sure of yourself, Monsieur Poirot. But beware, sometimes the hunter finds himself the hunted. Poirot's eyes glittered. Sometimes, monsieur. But not today. When Marsh had gone, Poirot remained in the silent room. He touched the back of Clara's chair lightly, then the untouched soup bowl, then the heavy silver ewer of water. Each small detail fixed itself in his mind. He murmured, "The time is almost come. One final gathering, one final stroke, and the mask shall fall." Hercule Poirot does not fail. The drizzle outside thickened once more into steady rain, and the manor seemed to shiver with the knowledge that soon, very soon, its secrets would be dragged into the light. Chapter 8. The Little Grey Cells Speak. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Grayleigh Manor sodden beneath a pale, exhausted sky. The silence after the rain was uncanny, as though the house itself waited, tense and unbreathing. Within, the household gathered in the library at Poirot's request. They came reluctantly, each burdened with their own fears. Clara leaned heavily on Henry Vale's arm, her face drawn but resolute. Edward entered with defiance, though his bravado was frayed. Mrs. Ludlow wrung her hands, whispering prayers under her breath. Marsh strolled in last, immaculate as ever, his expression one of polite boredom. Poirot stood by the hearth, a small figure of impeccable neatness, his moustaches gleaming, his eyes alight with purpose. Inspector Harwood waited nearby, notebook in hand. When all were seated, Poirot inclined his head. "Mesdames, messieurs, the time has come. You have lived these past days in fear, in suspicion. Each of you has been shadowed by doubt. But now, voila, the truth is ready to be spoken." The silence deepened. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed hushed. Poirot began softly. "First, we consider Lady Eleanor. She was poisoned, not by chance, not by carelessness, but by deliberate malice. Who, then, could profit by her death?" He turned towards Edward. "Her son, Monsieur Edward, drowning in debts. The world says, ah, here is the guilty one. He quarrels with his mother, he drinks, he wagers. And yet, I say none. For Edward's guilt is too plain, too loudly displayed. He makes himself suspect as though he wishes it. Such behavior is not that of the true criminal. It is camouflage." Edward blinked, astonished. You mean I'm not?" Poirot raised a finger. "I mean only that you are not the poisoner. Your sins are many, but murder is not among them." Edward sank back, trembling with relief and disbelief. Poirot's gaze moved to Henry. "Monsieur Vale, ambitious, protective, impatient with delay. You stand to gain by marriage to Clara. Many would say, here is motive, remove the mother, hasten the inheritance. But no. You are a man of action, not subterfuge. Poison, that most secretive of weapons, does not suit you." Henry flushed but held his tongue. Clara pressed his hand weakly. "Clara herself." Poirot continued gently. "No, no. Her grief is too real. And Mrs. Ludlow, faithful servant, loyal to her mistress, fearful of shadows. She has no gain from this crime. She is but a witness, nothing more." Mrs. Ludlow gave a sob, covering her face. Poirot's tone sharpened. "Thus we come to Monsieur Marsh. Calm, controlled, the solicitor, executor of the estate. Lady Eleanor trusted you deeply, perhaps too deeply. And yet, she had begun to suspect. In her unfinished letter, she wrote, "I have made a discovery which alarms me, concerning one close to me." That letter was addressed, Miss Amis, to Marsh. She had found something dangerous, something that made her fear for her safety. All eyes swung towards Marsh. He remained composed, though a faint line appeared between his brows. Poirot paced slowly before the hearth. What did she discover? Not merely dishonorable debts, not merely family quarrels. No. She discovered that her trusted adviser had betrayed her. Monsieur Marsh, you had manipulated her affairs, concealed transactions, diverted funds. For years perhaps you bled her estate. She began to see it. And so, she must be silenced. Marsh spoke at last, his voice calm. You make grave accusations, Monsieur Poirot. Where is your proof? Poirot's moustaches twitched. Proof? But of course. The little things, always the little things. Lady Eleanor's letter, broken off mid-sentence, she was interrupted. By whom? By you, monsieur, who visited her under pretence of business. You were the last to see her alive. Poirot held up a finger. Then, the poison tea for Clara. Why Clara? Because she inherits. So long as she lives, the estate passes beyond your control. Remove her, and the estate lingers in legal limbo, under your management. You could delay, entangle, enrich yourself quietly. Henry sprang up, furious. So it's Marsh. I knew it. Patience, monsieur, Poirot said sharply. Let me finish. He turned once more to Marsh. When I seized Clara's cup, I saw the powder not yet dissolved. A clumsy haste, monsieur. You took advantage of Mrs. Ludlow's moment of distraction, hoping no one would notice. But Hercule Poirot notices everything. Mrs. Ludlow gave a cry. I said, only for a moment, I turned away. Exactment, Poirot nodded. That moment was enough. The silence was suffocating. Marsh's calm mask had begun to crack, a muscle twitched at his jaw. Poirot stepped closer, his voice low and terrible in its certainty. Monsieur Marsh, you murdered Lady Eleanor Grayleigh. You attempted to murder her daughter. You, who seemed the most loyal, the most correct, you are the wolf in sheep's clothing. Clara gave a sob. Edward muttered, God, I never thought. Marsh rose slowly, his expression cold. This is nonsense. Circumstance, speculation. You have no evidence that would stand in any court. Poirot's eyes gleamed. On the contrary. The cup will be analyzed. The accounts, once examined, will reveal your thefts. And the testimony of this household will show your presence at each crucial moment. Non, monsieur. The game is over. Marsh's composure shattered. He gave a harsh laugh, sudden and bitter. Very clever, Poirot. Yes, I did it. Eleanor was growing suspicious, asking questions she should never have asked. She would have ruined me. I could not let that happen. As for Clara, she was weak, fragile. Better she follow her mother quickly than drag the matter into court. Clara shrank against Henry, horrified. Edward covered his face with his hands. Mrs. Ludlow wept openly. Inspector Harwood stepped forward, grim. Adrian Marsh, I arrest you for the murder of Lady Eleanor Grayleigh and the attempted murder of Clara Grayleigh. Marsh made no struggle. He merely straightened his cuffs, his smile bitter. So ends a promising career. Outplayed by a little Belgian with a moustache. Poirot bowed slightly. Merci, monsieur. It is always the little grey cells that triumph in the end. Harwood led Marsh away. The door closed heavily, leaving the survivors in stricken silence. Poirot turned to Clara, his voice gentle. Mademoiselle, the danger is past. Your mother is avenged. Clara whispered, I do not know how to thank you. Poirot inclined his head gravely. It is enough to know justice is done. Grief will remain, yes. But fear, it will trouble you no longer. The rain outside had ceased. A pale sun broke through the clouds, glinting faintly upon the wet lawns. Within the library, the air seemed lighter, as though the house itself had been freed from its shadow. Poirot stood quietly for a moment, gazing into the fire. Then he murmured, almost to himself, evil often wears a pleasant face. But always, always, the truth will out. Voila! And with that, Hercule Poirot, satisfied that the net had closed, smoothed his cuffs, adjusted his moustaches, and prepared to take his leave of Grayleigh Manor.